My friends, did you ever visit a friend's house after school for a gaming session with the boys, only to be met with an unfortunate abomination of a third-party controller? Especially back in the day, a lot of these controllers were sold because they were cheaper and not particularly good. One of these controllers was something called the Superpad, though there were actually a few called the Superpad, but this one in particular was quite clunky with shorter, thicker arms, making it quite uncomfortable to hold. But believe it or not, one of GoldenEye's most significant world records ever set, and one which remains the world record to this very day, was set using a Superpad just like this. So join me by the fireside and let's share the story of how one of the worst Nintendo 64 controllers ever was used to set one of GoldenEye's greatest records.
Here we go!
And indeed, my friends, what a pleasure to be back here by the fireside. A true wood-burning stove, smoldering away to keep us warm in the chill of the night. And not only that, I also am holding an old Superpad controller. I mean, take a look at that clunker. You would think, what is this perhaps not very useful thing? And I'm reticent to call it a piece of trash, because as we'll hear, it did have at least one very particular and historic use in GoldenEye speedrunning. So in order to understand exactly where it came into play, we have to know a bit about the history of GoldenEye speedrunning, and in particular a couple of world records that are important as we ponder the ages. In the year 2010, it was discovered that in GoldenEye, there are a whole bunch of control styles. We knew this, of course, back to day one pretty much, but in 2010 we discovered that the 2.x control styles, so using two controllers, can be particularly useful. Now, this is a bit of an awkward thing to do, but the benefit is the actions in the second controller, and I'm sure many of you know this already, process during the opening cutscene of each level. So for example, you can shoot or switch weapons, or even build speed, which is quite an important thing in speedrunning, during the opening cutscene, or even the closing cutscenes. And even that part was known. Like, there were all these tricks about shooting the Baron Samedi on Egypt at the end of the stage, or Natalia, or whatever it may be on Archives. And so it was known that the actions like shooting process during these cutscenes, but no one ever put them into use speedrunning wise. And that all began to change in 2010. And the reason for that is because it was discovered by a tool-assisted speedrunner that the full speed can start charging in the opening cutscene. So in order to pull this off, all you would have to do is have one controller, which you play normally, and have a second controller, which is your 2.x controller, as we call it, because there's 4 2-point-whatever control styles. And you would have to, say, hold the direction of your strafe the whole time you play the game. Now, this was particularly easy on one level, Streets, because all you would do is, if you know an N64 controller, when you press R, L, and start, it actually resets the controller as a new default. So for example, if you're holding down on the control stick, and you press R, L, and start, and then let go, well, the control stick is no longer being held down, it's naturally in the middle position. But because we reset the neutral point all the way down, it now thinks you're moving forward all the time. This is the fundamental basis for a technique that was called cruise control. That was used really from the early 2000s onwards with the 1.1 control style. Wouter Jansen was a prominent 1.1 player, and there were a handful of others, an early champion of the game. He used 1.1 a lot, and cruise control was a very important aspect of using 1.1. Some people pondered, should this be allowed, should it not be allowed? But you're pressing buttons on the controller, sort of readjusting, these sort of micro adjustments to your control scheme, and thus it was allowed. And people played like that. So in 2010, when it was discovered that full speed could be built on your second controller in the opening cutscene, on a level like Streets Agent, where the entire level is played in right strafe, what you would do on the second controller is you would hold down left, press RL start, and thus when you let go, the control stick would think it's moving up and to the right. Full speed, full strafe, upright. You could even ameliorate this by taking a rubber band and configuring it in such a way, this way or that way, where, now the control stick's really pulling in that direction at all times. You can be sure even beyond the setting of a reset neutrality that you're going to be moving, strafing full speed all the time. So everyone, for free, so long as you had a second controller, could gain this time, beginning the level at full speed, on Streets Agent. An instant time gain for everybody. And this saved about 0.36 seconds it was calculated to be. And this is the kind of technique that actually Mark Rutsu used as the sort of last straw to get the original Streets 112, a very legendary time in its own right. There was one other stage that people thought, okay, the 2.x control style can be kind of useful, and it's depot. And the reason depot is useful is because in the opening cutscene, or at least in 1/3 of the opening cutscenes, when you press Z on the second controller, you can actually shoot out the screen during the cutscene. The effect this has is that it lures guards out from a warehouse, they open a slow-moving rolling door, and thus you don't have to wait for that door to open, and it saves about 2.5 seconds. Obviously a very useful thing to do. Now the problem is on depot, you actually do have to change strafes with quite a bit of movement. So you were kind of burdened with the task of holding two controllers. One plays normally-ish with shooting and opening doors and changing your strafe direction. The other one, all you're doing is moving right and moving left. So it is a bit of a challenge to play. But it was deemed that because you could save 2.5, 3 seconds, that this extra challenge on depot was indeed worth it. So for a while, when these things were discovered, Streets and depot were the only stages where people played with two controllers. Slowly but surely, that would begin to change. And here's where we get to the core of this story. Because at this time, most people would still use two N64 controllers or whatever second controller they had lying around as their second controller. But the Superpad in particular was correctly identified by GoldenEye legend Big Boss Man as having some unique properties. And that being that the control stick is actually quite a bit longer, and it feels like it can kind of fit to the edge of the control stick area much more firmly, and thus you can be sure to maintain full speed. And so in the summer of 2012, when Boss started exploring using 2.x control styles, which, it took various players varying amount of times to explore, he figured, I'm going to use a Superpad as my second controller. He got a couple of times on Depot this way, Depot Secret Agent 41, Depot Double Agent 48, I believe, which may have been an untied world record at the time. Pretty remarkable stuff. But even more remarkable is the next record I'm going to talk about, and that is that of Runway Secret Agent. So Runway Secret Agent, and Runway Agent as well, and 00 for that matter, is a pretty short level, like overall probably the shortest in the game on all three difficulties, if you added up all three difficulties in the total tally. And so they're very optimized very quickly. For a long time, since about 2001, the world record was 23 seconds set by Carl Jobst, the one and only. And this, at the time, was the game's longest standing record, because a lot of other stuff, these optimized times had been beaten by Boss himself or Wouter in 2002, 3, 4. I've discussed those at length in various videos as well. But Runway Secret Agent 23 remained the record, and it became the game's easiest record to tie. A 23-second level, rounded down to the full second. A lot of new players would set it out in their sights to get a cool tied world record, which was a fun kind of early milestone to shoot for. But Boss thought, let's do it up, baby. Let's improve this. And so he figured out the Superpad is a really good controller, and all you have to do on it for the second controller on Runway Secret Agent is you start out in left strafe. Okay, you hold it all the way to the left, On the first controller, you're kind of changing the direction, pressing B at the door to get in, get the key, and then once you get the key, now you have to hold all the way to the right on the Superpad. And now you're kind of strafing down the runway, so on and so forth, and you carry on through the mission. And Boss found a way in which he could play perfectly and strafe perfectly thanks to the power of the Superpad. It took a very remarkable sort of twist and turn grenade throw in order for him to complete the stage and make the battery throw, which is the difference between Secret Agent and Agent. But that twist, the record on Agent at the time was 22 seconds, and that twist, cost less than 0.3, which, starting in 2.x control style, the time saved. It ended up being worth it in the end. Now, this was not without controversy. There were a handful of people who pondered, pretty much any development in GoldenEye. Should this be allowed? Should we allow, third-party controllers? And generally speaking, they can be unusual abominations and strange controllers that aren't very comfortable to play with. But at the end of the day, it was decided that most of the players saw no problem with allowing these kinds of things. Superpads back then on eBay were like $10, back in the day when you could get things really cheap. Who else remembers that? There were various discussions, and a lot of the history of the GoldenEye administratively can be a bit unusual, with a lot of these kind of non-players and peripheral community members having been involved in administering and managing the rankings, and they were kind of against allowing third-party controllers. But most of the players said, you know what, it's only going to be for a level or two. Why not allow it? And that was that. Now, how little we knew, because in the modern age of GoldenEye speedrunning, almost everyone plays 2.x control style. And so whether you're kind of, free roaming with one in each hand, changing strafes right, left, and here, some will try to use their toe at some point. They call it toe point X as a pun on 2.x. Or some people, like myself and famously Carl Jobst, we taped controllers together, making one giant dual analog controller. I named mine the Chimera, which I thought was appropriate because you're kind of blending two controllers together. Carl named his Widow's Wail, which is the same name of Joffrey Baratheon's sword in Game of Thrones. Perhaps that says something about him to name his controller after Joffrey's sword. Take that for what you will. But I think what he was going for was that he used it to slay Dam 52, or achieve Dam 52, thus, causing the wail of hundreds of players losing a world record. That was the kind of idea behind the nomenclature there. And I think us two were the only ones who actually taped together controllers and made that kind of thing. A few people, there is one famous actual modification controller, and I don't know how many have ever been made throughout history, and I've never tried it. It's like a full blend in a shop of the plastic mold 2-in-1, which is a pretty remarkable thing. And that's what a lot of people complain about on the N64 is the controller not having dual analog stick. But the developers of GoldenEye were so clever and intelligent that they included it, at least an option for it, in the game, kind of knowing that dual analog was the way controlling games was headed. And I mean, kudos to them for seeing well ahead of time. Nowadays, many, many levels, people have thought, how can I learn to play even these complicated levels like Jungle or Silo with 2.x to save that third of a second at the start of the stage? And I don't know how they do it. They've mastered it well beyond me. I'm sure if you started out learning the game when you were, say, 16 or 17, which a lot of these young Zoomers did, learning 2.x right off the bat, they got quite good at it. And, kudos to them, getting some great stuff. Surface 1. I don't know how Cali W got these Surface 1 times with 2.x. Just to never miss a left or right strafe, even though it's very clunky, is just remarkable. But what's more remarkable is that Runway Secret Agent 22 Second by the Big Boss Man, set in summer 2012, using the abominable Superpad, is still the world record today and is the game's oldest world record. It's now been a record for 13 and a half years, thousands and thousands of days and still counting. You know, Runway Agent 21 has happened, but that's like so tight and so perfect that it's widely believed that you don't just have enough boosts and the turn to throw the nade to take out the battery, which is the extra objective on Secret Agent, just costs a little bit too much time to make 21 possible on Secret Agent. You know, I wouldn't discount it entirely. Maybe it'll happen someday. But as of right now, Runway Secret Agent 22, achieved by boss with the Superpad, is the game's longest standing world record, period. And by that regard, one of the game's most significant and possibly greatest records ever set. And that, my friends, is the story of how the Superpad was used to achieve one of GoldenEye's greatest records. So I hope you enjoyed that story as the fire's still blazing gently behind us. I'm pleased to be here by another wood-burning fireside. I hope to have many, many more stories to tell. And hey, if you come across a really unusual third-party N64 controller, I would love to hear about it in the comments or reach out to me and share a picture somehow, because I would love to see it. But there you go, my friends. A huge thanks to you for watching. A big thanks to the Patreon supporters and the channel members for all of your support. Stay true, my friends, and I will see you in the next stream, video, or fireside. Good night.